Hello, I hope you all had a happy Thanksgiving. And we will begin with our class today. So let's see, there we go. We are talking today about contemporary graphic design, and next week we will be talking about web design. And so I will provide a couple of examples in the lecture, and then you have to create a slightly more intense post, right? Because you have to create a video. You actually have to make a short presentation, but a presentation nevertheless, because we have to have a what do we call it? The not sponsored, the proctored activity. And well, we're not having one, but we are then doing a video where you can show me your face essentially. So that is the deal. And look at the instructions. I'll probably send you an announcement later today or in the middle of the week about that as well. But you have to create a video, and you can film yourself using what I use, which is Zoom. You just create you have a meeting with yourself essentially, and then you make a recording and you make a short presentation of one example. So today we're going to talk about contemporary graphic design. It's a follow-up from last week. We continue to be in the kind of postmodern period, and it's just that in the 90s, for some reason, it seems to intensify itself. So that's what we're talking about. So this is grunge. I am sure you know what this is. And so we're just going to go over it and understand the larger implications for the history of graphic design beyond, the specific look of it. When we think of grunge, usually we think of something that is unkempt, ragged, and disheveled, right? I did not come up with those words myself. I read them, but nevertheless, I think it makes the point. It's something that seems, I typically associate it with ripped jeans for some reason. Or I don't know, a certain kind of appearance that looks intentionally unkempt. All right. So there's one thing is to be unkempt because you didn't have time to take a shower, or you just it's a matter of distraction and just bad habits. Another one is to intentionally look a certain way to make a point in society, either because you're following the style, even if you don't understand necessarily what it means. But typically, especially at the beginning, it is really an intentional defiance of, in the case of graphic design, of the international style, right? So how do we know that? We're looking at one example, which is very, very interesting, by a designer that is the most famous and notorious, I would say, designer for doing this. And his name is David Carson, right? And David Carson was hired to create, essentially to design this magazine about music. And not surprisingly, because again, this kind of activity has to already kind of grow out of an artistic endeavor, right? I mean, it wouldn't appear as part of a business. It needed to be part of music. It needed to be part of not even art, right? Because again, or design or art, because that is too close together with the professional life of a graphic designer. So the music industry, or the music world, you could say, especially in Seattle, allowed for this design, this type of design, this style to appear, perhaps. But as you can see, this is a design, this is a spread of a magazine. So we are looking at 2 pages here from 1993. So it's going to be 30 years next year of this. And it shows the breaking of all conventions possible, right, in everywhere. So essentially, it breaks the rules of legibility and the standard design method for the pursuit of expression. We have already seen some of that with postmodern design, with Paula Scher, for example, last week. But this is going far, far beyond that, right? Because where we're looking at deliberate errors, it's not simply a matter of expressing yourself, it's a matter of conceptually rejecting what is believed to be right, right? It's like being a naughty child, essentially. You want to defy your parents because you don't like the rules. And so you essentially just break the rules on purpose and do everything opposite of the rules to make your point, right? Beyond what you want to do. So that is exactly what Carson did. And we are looking at that in here. So just for the sake of contrast, right, we're looking at, we looked at this last week, but I want to read it a little bit. It says design for people. Needless to say that this is Helvetica, right? And it actually gives us like instructions about how to do that, right? So there are certain instructions. Empathize, define, ideate, word that I have never heard before, prototype, and test, okay? So essentially, these are several very systematic steps with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 that tell you, well, first, kind of empathize, understand deeply what the purpose of what you need to do is going to be. What are you designing for? Who is your target audience? Who is going to be looking at this? What is the company's profile, et cetera, et cetera. Do your research and kind of not just simply gather information, but truly understand. Then you have to define, right? What do you want to do? Your objectives, all right? Then you will create a concept to fit those objectives, also reflecting the empathy that you have created. Then you create a prototype, or maybe more than one, right? Typically more than one. And so you'll design something that will be not obviously the final product, but the first few tries. And then you will test it. And this is key. You will get other people to give their opinion, or even you might do something more like quantitative data style where you gather impressions. You might ask people to read and see how fast they can read, or how they feel about the clarity of the layout, for example, the contrast, all of those things, right? So we are, as designers, typically you are supposed to follow these steps. Well, what did Carson do? Probably none of that, because his goal is not to create something for people. He's not designing for people. He's designing for himself. And yes, he has an audience, right? It's the audience that he has is the people he wants to please in a way, but he isn't really thinking about that. And much more the people he wants to kind of piss off, to be quite honest. So essentially those that are in the conventional, at this point, conventional design world that are doing things following a certain system and method, and he's doing the opposite. And so he's breaking all the rules, because other than these steps, there are many, many rules. Photographs, typically, we like them to be clear, right? I mean, and to have a good contrast with the background, to have a clarity, to show something that makes sense. So here we can see that, especially this photograph is really borderline kind of ghostly, right? And that is very important. He does this on purpose. It looks like he just ripped it out of a page. Also, so it's not that it's properly cut or given a certain shape intentionally in a polished way, kind of clean looking way. That's why this is called grunge, because it has a kind of dirty look to it, right? Not dirty in a conceptual sense, but dirty in aesthetics. So the photograph, which presumably shows the musicians, is very blurry, very discolored. Even the shapes appear to be kind of cut out, right? I mean, it's almost like they become really abstracted. So all of that. There's a second photograph in there, the same thing. And so this is about, he was criticizing a group, right? And he this is the name of the group. And he puts a question mark because he's criticizing them. Then there's the overprinting, right? Essentially overprinting letters one on top of the other, impeding literally legibility, but more than that, readability. And just to remind yourself, what are the differences between these two terms? Legibility is the ability to distinguish one letter from another, right? So as you know, when you, in typography, there are certain letters that look similar. For example, especially in lowercase, the N and the U, right? or certain others, right? That have common forms, and so they might, depending on the design, they might end up looking too similar. If they are too similar and we don't have a context, we sometimes get confused, right? So that is the aspect of legibility, which of course we need to try to, I mean, if you follow the design for people structure, you need to try to pursue, right? And then readability is the ability to read, to actually comprehend the text literally from the ease of the way the type is set, right? A layout is created. So none of that is clearly happening here. We have especially no readability whatsoever. And because, again, the letters are overlapping each other, then definitely we also don't have legibility. We also have not much contrast. Look at life here, right? I mean, we can barely see life sucks, and we can only recognize that, or at least I can, because it says sucks. And so we can see that, you know, it should be life, right? We're going to recognize that from the context. So something like other words, in other words, life sucks, and then you die. That's correct, right? But again, that is, you really need to make an effort to read that. And we know that, you know, we know that in the international style approach to design, we are not supposed to make an effort. We are just supposed to read, period. We are not even supposed to know that the letters are there, right? And here it becomes, you know, we have to pay attention to the letters because we have to make an effort to read them. Another thing that he did was leave, or what appeared to be, these layout, alignment boxes, right? When you are designing, those of you who are graphic designers, you know that you need to think in terms of blocks of text, right? And so it looks like he maybe forgot to remove the alignment boxes, right? Some of them don't seem to make any sense, like an oval here. Not that that's unheard of, but again, you know, there's nothing inside the oval. There seem to be some irregular shapes also. And so he created an irregular shaping here with the, you know, the alignment box that is not a box. And then he aligned the text along that shape. So again, it doesn't seem to make any logical sense. It doesn't seem to serve a purpose, neither an aesthetic nor a functional one, right? So there's that. And then finally, we have this kind of triangular shape here, or whatever this is, very, very close to the gutter, right? So all of this makes this, by all standards, a bad design, right? But it was very original, and it was revolutionary in its own time. He essentially inaugurated, not with this specific design, right? This is just one good example, but where he essentially inaugurated a new era that in a way opened up the gates for something different. So now this was in the context, let's talk about some background. So where does this come from? Everything always comes from somewhere else, as we know. It's not new. The attitude of, you know, the attitude of doing something counterculture had already existed since the 1960s in these psychedelic posters that we looked at, right? But the attitude there is different. Why is that? Because it seems these people were in California. They were not necessarily, I mean, Wes Wilson had studied art, but not graphic design. And he was making posters, and he was very good at it, right? But he did not necessarily see himself as a professional graphic designer. He saw himself as a talented artist who could put his artistic talent to the service of music bands that he enjoyed promoting. And of course, he got paid to do it. And there were several other designers along the same lines. But they weren't directly attacking the international style. They were like working on the margins almost, right? Like saying, oh, we're going to do something different and cool, and it will evoke perhaps, you know, the kind of psychedelic mindset with under the influence of LSD, but it's not really, it is a response in context, but it's not a direct attack. So this is different. David Carson was a professionally trained graphic designer, and he is directly responding to this, corporate design, essentially. And he is, of course, also, there were presidents and other people working along the same lines or similar, but still, his method is perhaps the most radical. So we have that. Then, of course, a little bit earlier, you might remember, we had the Pushpin monthly graphic. The Pushpin monthly graphic was, they just found or looked for intentionally these wooden letter forms that they would just collect, and then they did, they used them, right? It was a matter of, like, again, kind of breaking the rules, because these were actually graphic designers by profession, right? So they were intentionally breaking the rules. But again, it has that more like playful approach to it, right? And they are using something that already exists. Eventually, they begin to invent their new type. But at this point, they are still kind of experimenting and sort of saying, "Oh, let's just be playful." All right, so that's what they are doing. You probably remember Dada. So Dada, again, the Dada is more intentional. If there is a kind of direct precedent, you could say, to what Carson is doing, it is definitely Dada, because the Dada were in a completely different context, in the context of the First World War. They are actually attacking traditional culture, right? But the major difference is what? The major difference is that the Dada were a tiny group in Switzerland, very marginal. Nobody really cared about what they did. Nobody really knew about them until later, right? So they were working on the margins, whereas Carson was really not working on the margins, as I shall show you in a little bit, in part because of the information age, right? I mean, the news just traveled faster, you could say. So again, he becomes very famous very quickly, and his intentions are, evident very quickly. And of course, again, going all the way back to the 19th century, we get to see the John Sanger and Sons circus, Royal Circus poster. And that one is not in an intentional attack on anything. It's just that, again, the designers were being practical and playful at the same time, and they were trying to save money, right, by putting a lot of text into a page. So those are very different attitudes to design, these four that I have just talked about, and they are not identical by any means to this, but they all on some level are precedents to it, right? Because they are working against, you could say, or they are interpreted to be working against the standard way of doing things, if that makes sense. Now, there was, of course, Paula Scher, right, that we had discussed before, and she was clearly working along the same time. I mean, this is not the first poster that she makes. So she had made a few posters for the New York Public Theater, the Public Theater. But nevertheless, the style that she uses is, in my opinion, not comparable, right? I mean, it is comparable, but it's not similar in any way, other than the fact that she's playing with type in a way to, it's very different from the international style. She's filling up the page. There's like what we call, I forgot to put the words there, it's called horror vacui, which means fear of, actually horror of emptiness, right? So it's almost like she fills the entire page, very different from, let's say, the modernists who love white space, right? But nevertheless, this really responds to the avant-gardes, right? To futurism, to Russian constructivism. It is more playful. It is more positive even, right? I mean, think of the words noise funk, right? It just evokes fun. It is not an attack. It is an affirmation of a culture. It's not an attack on another culture. That's the way I see it, right? This is a much more affirmative attitude of perhaps, Black culture or counterculture, but nevertheless, it's affirmative. Whereas this is really attacking it. Already the words show you that, and the aesthetic attitude does too, right? So it's a very, very different approach. They are working from different angles. All right, now, I'm sorry. Carson became a celebrity very quickly. I mean, he did this in 93, and then in 94, already in Europe, not in the US, in Europe, he got hired by Nike to do a publicity. Now, Nike, as you know, is a major corporation, and this is what he did, right? And I don't know how much, if he got hired to continue to do this, but anyway, he did, and this got published. So essentially, what we have is a magazine spread again that has these two tiny blurry. This is not a bad picture. This is the way it is. All right. Very blurry Nike orange Nike logo and like little square like that. They look like stamps, right? And they're just kind of floating in the space, right? And that is very unsatisfactory. We know that we like things to kind of have a place. But it seems very much like a floating things. And then, of course, the same thing, the overprinting, the confusing text, besides of the fact that this is written in another language, and so I can't read it, but nevertheless, it really is confusing. Presumably, this is the mark of the shoe, right, or the sole. Hard to tell. But anyway, he got hired to do this by a corporation. So this tells you how interesting this is, right? Because in the prior image, we are looking at a counterculture, right? I mean, he's working within the music industry, but in here, he's working with a corporation, and within a year, this corporation adopts this style, at least temporarily, right, in Europe. And they ask him to design a publicity in this style, which is completely different from anything they had ever done. So again, it's kind of wanting to be on the trend, right? For the sake of counter argument or contrast, right? Let's look at Coca-Cola, Burger King, and New York. These designs are not, I mean, especially these two, they are not your very strong focused design, but they definitely are not this, right? They are more commercial. I mean, here again, the space is organized carefully. The family is inside an oval. Yes, there is overlapping and not really overprinting, but overlapping of the letters with the text, and it has a bit of chaos, right? But the necessary one to evoke a sense of family happiness, right? I mean, after all, they are eating burgers and drinks in a restaurant, so it can't be super tidy. The souvenir letter that they chose is very, has bubble, it's like a bubbly quality to it. So it has, again, this kind of happiness look to it, right? Same thing with this one. And again, that sort of human element brought into the type, for example, by the rounded edges here. And of course, they're very simple and hard. The Coca-Cola one looks more professional, partly because of the Helvetica, but also because, again, it's about Christmas and everything looks kind of wrapped up, right, like a present. But regardless, even if there's a little bit of not straightforward international style in them, and again, they are becoming more open-minded, nothing like this, right? This is completely different in attitude, in style, in every sense. So you can see how different this is. All right. Now, I just put this in here because I found it and I thought it was interesting. Presumably, this is a declaration. I have to confess, I have not read it, but nevertheless, what he says in here, this is him. He says, don't mistake legibility for communication, right? Because, of course, this was the first criticism that he receives. Like, what is this? We can't read it. It's not clear. It's bad composition. Who told you this is good? That kind of thing, right? And so he's essentially saying, well, but the goal is not in graphic design, it's not legibility or even readability. It is communication. Communication of what? Well, communication of an idea, right? An idea of disorder in this case. So that is it's a completely different approach to what we have been looking at. Now, there were no precedents for this, not so intense. So we are leaving Carson now, and we're going to rebellious typography. Okay, one very popular new typeface that was invented was template Gothic, and we will begin to see the word Gothic over and over again, evoked and again eventually references to black letter, because for some reason it seems, it's probably a reference to Franklin Gothic as well. He begins with, this is actually a reworking, very reworked, right, of typefaces such as Accidence Grotesque and Franklin Gothic. But nevertheless, the word Gothic is perhaps important. Now, what do you think of these letters? I have to tell you that I have seen them many times, even before this lecture, and they always appear weak to me, right? This is the bold version of it, right? So all of these, I think these have been bolded, but this is the original one, right? And if you look at them, look at the A, for example, it looks, first of all, it's a little hazy, right? It's not very sharp. Then they have this, they end, right? The terminals are kind of pointy, but it's not really sharp pointy. It's sort of undecisive pointy. They can't quite make up this mind, these letters, right? In terms of how they end. Then if we look at some of the things in here, they have these curves, right? That are very, I don't know, they just, they look weak. They don't look strong. They don't look assertive, right? At the end here, right? It's not that we haven't seen letters that are wide and they become thin, but in this particular one, they really are just not strong looking, right? They don't look energetic. They don't look assertive. And that's intentional, all right? Because it intended to be kind of a hybrid. It intended to look somewhat mechanical, right? Because again, it was produced mechanically, but at the same time, manually, right? So it intended to look like print made by hand, right? When you're writing with a pen, but at the same time, print that was produced with a machine. And that's why it looks weak, because it's almost like it wants to be strong, but it can't, right? So it's a very interesting typeface, not my favorite, but I still understand where it's coming from. And it was used quite a lot, right? So again, I'd say popular, and it's still used today. It's the one, or if not a very similar one, that Carson was using in a lot of his designs. All right, for the sake of contrast, of course, here you have Helvetica, again, strong, assertive, not a lot of space, not a lot of, space between the letters, right? Negative space is compressed in there. And here again, they are more further apart from each other, and they are just thinner and weaker overall, right? But what Barry Deck, who designed it, said was template Gothic captures the imperfect language of an imperfect world inhabited by imperfect beings. So essentially, what he's saying is this is the typeface for an imperfect world. And again, the 1990s were perceived as an imperfect time, right? I mean, it's almost like this acknowledgement of, we have problems, we have mental health issues, we have confusion in our minds about our identity, lots and lots of things, right? And so it's very, very different than the Helvetica from 1957, in which there were all these confusions, I'm sure, but they were kind of perhaps repressed, you could say, right? So, the typeface is significant in this way. It really reflects kind of the mood of the period. Yes, it is practical, right? I mean, it serves many functions and all that, and we know that, but at the same time, the extensive popularity of it in not just signage, right? that is meant to be practical tells us that this really resonated with the way people felt or wanted to feel. Whereas this perhaps resonates with, it's still very legible, right? I mean, I think we can, that we can give it to, it is still very legible, but it really has this human imperfect quality to it. It seems to want to be strong, and it kind of does not look very convincing in that sense. All right, so very interesting. Okay, now we get to the true extreme. This is Elliot Earls typeface called Blue Eyeshadow. Just the name is very interesting already as it is. This is essentially the true, I mean, the extreme grunge, I would say, right? The letters are confusing. I have to tell you that I have looked and searched, and I have not been able to find, maybe you can, and if you can, please send it to me, an actual design where this is used, right? From this period, from like the, 2000s, early 2000s. For some reason, I don't know, I have a couple of databases that I've been using to get examples, and I have not been able to find, I mean, there are simplified versions of it. There's actually one in Word and in PowerPoint. They are simplified versions, but the extreme one, which is this one with all these fancy decorations, you could say, that really are interrupted, and they seem, again, they add an element of weakness to the letter. I have not been able to find. Look at the K. Let's look at the K for a minute. It's kind of interrupted, right? I mean, it ends here. There's a gap in the letter. I'm sorry. There's a gap in the letter, and then it continues, right? It becomes really, really thin, and then it becomes a little thicker again and curvy, right? And they really think very haphazard. Of course, they were designed with care. I'm not saying no, but they are nevertheless much more, this is more than just being human, right? Or being human, weak human. This is really just intentionally defying convention, as we say. It has a number of things that are very interesting. So I wanted to tell you about the designer. So Elliot Earls is definitely against corporate, well, not corporate, but he's against the international style, right? So in his resume, he actually noted that in 2 instances, he had been fired from a company. He had been fired from the Harak and Pauline Associates in New York for general incompetence. So he actually, when he was looking for a job, he put that in his resume. And then he said in 1995, he was fired from Elektra Records for the same reason. Well, essentially, that's a declaration of his position, because the Harak and Pauline Associates was, again, a very international style-oriented company. The fact that he was fired from it essentially indicated that he was against that, right? It seems like a strange move to put that in your resume if you're trying to get a job, but again, he's doing it precisely to demonstrate his position, right? His ideological position, you could say. So he creates Blue Eyeshadow, and it is very, very, I don't know, not legible, especially if the letters were to actually be close together and to connect, right? Okay, so what do they have? They have, in my opinion, something that letters used to have back in the Roman Empire, right, in antiquity. Essentially, illegibility. You probably remember the idea of scriptio continua. Scriptio continua is when the letters there's no separation in the words, right? So from the look of it, because they appear to have, they are not really ligatures, but they are these little tails, let's say, that come out of them, then they appear to be ligatures. So they clearly impede legibility. Right, ligatures were these letters in antiquity had these connecting forms, but they did serve a purpose. They added confusion, but they did serve a purpose in antiquity, which was to connect the letters, like we do in cursive, right? They would still be print, but they would have the ligatures. Now here, it really is more of a decorative feature. And so because it's decorative, it's really like playful and excessive. What is the purpose that this serves? Well, none, right? Other than to perhaps defy convention. So again, the Roman scripts that I showed you at the beginning of the semester, and it doesn't matter if you remember the names, but they were cursive essentially. Here they did create this. They were working in a university called, well, the word escaped me. But they are working in a program, he and other graphic designers, called the Apollo Program Font Set, right? And this is just one. So this is, again, a little bit of an example of how the type would have been used or was used, perhaps. And you can see it's largely unreadable, right? And if you can read it, it takes you a long time. So clearly very, very different. They actually, in this project, they began from distorted fonts that existed. So they did begin from things, again, like Accidents Grotesque and El Helvetica, but they didn't really stick to them in any way. They purposefully, playfully distorted them, and this was through hand lettering, right? So they are not using any machine, they are not casting the type by any means yet, or anything of the sort. I mean, this was before, well, actually 2000 we did have computers, but nevertheless, they are not doing it. They are doing handwriting. I want to show you this link, which I found. So it's, I think you can still see this, right? Hopefully. Yes, screen sharing. Okay, so this is Dr. Cobra is a student of Elliot Earls, right? And so these are some of the designs that he made, inspired by Elliot Earls. So I'm just going to scroll down. I found this really, really interesting. They are all, again, in the same spirit, right? And he credits his teacher for having inspired him. All right. This one, he says, is inspired in his own handwriting. He actually designed the type. He wrote something and he said, this is going to be a type that I will design and use and patent, right? It's called Casual Mode Script. And then again, this one, which is even more expressive, if we want to be nice, even more expressive than a Blue Eyeshadow. All right. And then he did invent or design a couple more that are inspired, and this was interesting, they're inspired by illuminated manuscripts. So if we did look at a couple of illuminated manuscripts, I don't remember if we looked at the Lindisfarne Gospels, but nevertheless, the letters were sometimes filled with color, right? And they are slightly distorted because they are seen as decorative. In the illuminated manuscripts from the Middle Ages, the letters are embellished with color and they are distorted essentially on purpose, right? In order to bring illumination or decoration to the Word of God. So here he is deriving some letters. Look at some of these things. The X is very interesting, right? Looks like a standing person with its arms up. So he called this crucible serif, okay? And then this one he called crucible sans. So he created two. So this is clearly experimental typography, right? And they are doing this. The question is, who do they sell this to? And so that's what we're gonna see in just a minute. But Dr. Cobra again is working in under the direction or inspired by Elliot Earls. Okay. All right, so closing that, and let's move on. Oh, now I hope I didn't mess this up. All right, the next thing we have is, of course, what we call vernacular sources. So graffiti, right? Graffiti wasn't new by any means, but it becomes all the more resonant perhaps during this time thanks to these designs. This is from 2003. This was actually designed by designers called Full-Time Artists, and what we're looking here is essentially established type. So again, legibility is not a premium here by any means. On the contrary, it's really expressive, right? I don't know where the mouse is. Gee, hope you can see this. Let's do that again, just in case. All right. Again, this is graffiti, and it's from vernacular sources, inspired by vernacular sources. What vernacular means, local and associated with it, produced by people. And so that is exactly what this is. It's graffiti artists, by which we mean just people who want to go against the grain and want to decorate walls without permission. They would use a variety of fonts or types or manners of writing that they had developed over time. And so this one is systematized, right, into this wild style. It's actually called like that, wild style typeface. And here we have A, B, C, D, E, blah, 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 blah. Well, other than, there is a word here, I try to read it, suilas, perhaps, wildest, styles, right? So perhaps wild styles, that's it. That's wild styles, typeface. But you can see that if you look at the letters independently, they look very, very similar to each other, right? There's no real distinction between, let's say, the A and I don't know, they just look all the same. And so it's very difficult to follow this text. And this is on purpose to create counterculture, to go against the grain, to go against polite society, corporations, etc. Interestingly enough, the precedent for that is, not surprisingly after all, psychedelic design, right? Which again was it really, again, it's something that grows out of a need to express for the music bands to have an identity that was different from traditional culture, and it exists kind of in the margins, right? So this is kind of the same thing, except that by the time a designer designs this, we have something that is very much more established. Oh, one thing is here, the drops of paint that of course can be interpreted as drops of blood, right? Especially when this is red. So that is quite significant. All right, I'm going to stop for a minute and we're gonna then go to corporate advertising.